Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the February 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The Nationalization of the Land from 1872 by Karl Marx. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this was a paper read at the Manchester section of the International Workingmen's Association. This is basically the first Socialist International. It was written by Marx in March and April 1872 and published in the International Herald, number 11, June 15, 1872. The online version was taken from the newspaper and transcribed by director at Marx.org. Thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive at Marxists.org for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out and support them. So this text is kind of a quickie, but it's a very important subject. The nationalization of the land is one of the things that in socialism makes so many things work that really can't work under capitalism. For example, if you read Lenin's On Cooperation, he discusses the role of cooperatives in building socialism, which is just not a function of cooperatives in capitalism, and the nationalization of the land is a key reason for that. So anyway, without further ado, let's hear some of Marx's thoughts on this subject. The property in the soil is the original source of all wealth, and has become the great problem upon the solution of which depends the future of the working class. I do not intend discussing here all the arguments put forward by the advocates of private property in land, by jurists, philosophers, and political economists, but shall confine myself firstly to state that they have tried hard to disguise the primitive fact of conquest under the cloak of, quote, natural right. If conquest constituted a national right on the part of the few, the many have only to gather sufficient strength in order to acquire the natural right of reconquering what has been taken from them. In the progress of history, the conquerors found it convenient to give to their original titles, derived from brute force, a sort of social understanding through the instrumentality of laws imposed by themselves. At last comes the philosopher, and demonstrates that those laws imply and express the universal consent of mankind. If private property in land be indeed founded upon such a universal consent, it will evidently become extinct from the moment the majority of a society dissents from warranting it. However, leaving aside the so-called rights of property, I assert that the economical development of society, the increase and concentration of people, the very circumstances that compel the capitalist farmer to apply to agriculture, collective and organized labor, and to have recourse to machinery and similar contrivances, will more and more render the nationalization of land a social necessity, against which no amount of talk about the rights of property can be of any avail. The imperative wants of society will and must be satisfied. Changes dictated by social necessity will work their own way, and sooner or later adapt legislation to their interests. So I'm just going to pause here. Let's just recap the text up to this point. So Marx says that the property in the soil is the original source of all wealth. Labor may be the source of value, but really without soil that can grow things and sustain human life and is literally the ground that we walk on, none of that's possible. So very important topic, and Marx says that it has become the great problem upon the solution of which depends the future of the working class. So working class has to take charge of the soil, the original source of all wealth. So then Marx differentiates what he's trying to say from the arguments that are put forward by the advocates of private property, specifically private property with regard to land. So there's various jurists, philosophers, and political economists that come out and make arguments for having land as private property. And basically, Marx dismisses them, saying that they have tried hard to disguise the primitive fact of conquest under the cloak of natural right. So basically saying, well, private property, it's really just conquest, and there's nothing really naturally right about it. In fact, if that was natural right, then the many, the working masses, also have a natural right if they just get organized to reconquer what has been taken from them. So then, following this conquest, you get the development and administration of laws, which are instruments of basically enforcing this conquest and maintaining it. Really, though, it's just derived from brute force, that initial conquest of the land as private property. And then, true to the materialist basis of Marxism, along comes the philosopher. And once this material basis of private property has been established, the philosophers come along and they start to wax poetically about the consent of the society because, oh, we have these laws and there's this existing legal order, therefore it must mean that everybody's consenting. And this is the ideology of private property that is just spun out of the material reality of private property. But Marx says about this, well, let's assume for a minute that this is all correct and the society actually is giving consent for private property. As soon as the majority of society dissents and no longer has that consent, then, I guess that we're done with the whole consent phase to private property. So then Marx continues, and here the piece takes a turn. He says, all right, but whatever you want to say about the rights of property or consent or this or that, his point is that the economic development of society and the more that people come together under capitalism to work collectively in an organized way, at some point, you're going to have to nationalize the land. Marx calls it a social necessity against which no amount of talk about the rights of property can be of any avail. So, in other words, you had this stage where the land was privatized and capitalists worked it. However, the tendency of capitalism is to centralize and organize labor. And at a certain point, it's organized enough that the next logical step to actually continue economic and social development is to nationalize the land. Like the private boundaries between tracts of land actually become an impediment. So let's continue with the text now. What we require is a daily increasing production, and its exigencies cannot be met by allowing a few individuals to regulate it according to their whims and private interests, or to ignorantly exhaust the powers of the soil. Very good point. All modern methods, such as irrigation, drainage, steam plowing, chemical treatment, and so forth, ought to be applied to agriculture at large. But the scientific knowledge we possess and the technical means of agriculture we command, such as machinery, etc., can never be successfully applied but by cultivating the land on a large scale. If the cultivation on a large scale proves, even under its present capitalist form, that degrades the cultivator himself to a mere beast of burden, so superior from an economical point of view to small and piecemeal husbandry, would it not give an increased impulse to production if applied on national dimensions? So what Marx is saying here is society requires more and more production, and you're not going to meet that production by allowing a few individuals to just sort of privately do things as they please. You're going to have to apply scientific knowledge to agriculture and cultivate it on a large scale. And just as like really small sort of peasant farming gives way to much larger plots of land, even those larger plots of land probably eventually will give way to even larger scale production, what Marx calls production applied on national dimensions. Continuing, the ever-growing wants of the people on the one side, the ever-increasing price of agricultural produce on the other, afford the irrefutable evidence that the nationalization of land has become a social necessity. Such a diminution or lessening of agricultural produce as springs from individual abuse will, of course, become impossible whenever cultivation is carried on under the control and for the benefit of the nation. All the citizens I have heard here today during the progress of the debate on this question defended the nationalization of land, but they took very different views of it. So we're going to pause there again before Marx gets into the particular examples of France versus England, etc., Keep in mind, this is 1872, and we're now today in 2022 looking at a situation 150 years later where agricultural production absolutely has been centralized. It's done on enormous plots of land. Small and piecemeal farming has been done away with decades ago. Not entirely, but definitely it has been done away with to a very great extent compared to the 1870s, for example. And large agribusiness companies, in fact, tend to extremely large plots of land. This is at least in the United States. Also, there are all kinds of subsidies of products like corn, which is processed into a million different things, sugars, starches, even non-food items. And while the sort of nationalization that Marx and the socialists were talking about has not taken place in the United States, this is still on a for-profit basis, the amount of interventions in this market are pretty substantial. May we actually nationalize the land sooner rather than later? Anyway, continuing. France was frequently alluded to, but with its peasant proprietorship, it is farther off the nationalization of land than England with its landlordism. In France, it is true, the soil is accessible to all who can buy it, but this very facility has brought about a division into small plots cultivated by people with small means and mainly relying upon the land by exertions of themselves and their families. This form of landed property and the piecemeal cultivation it necessitates, while excluding all appliances of modern agricultural improvements, converts the tiller himself into the most decided enemy to social progress, and above all, the nationalization of land. Enchained to the soil upon which he has to spend all his vital energies in order to get a relatively small return, having to give away the greater part of his produce to the state in the form of taxes, to the law tribe in the form of judiciary costs, and to the usurer in the form of interest, utterly ignorant of the social movements outside his petty field of employment, still he clings with fanatic fondness to his bit of land and his merely nominal proprietorship in the same. In this way, the French peasant has been thrown into a most fatal antagonism to the industrial working class. Peasant proprietorship being, then, the greatest obstacle to the nationalization of land, France in its present state is certainly not the place where we must look to for a solution of this great problem. So just a quick comment there. Basically what Marx is saying is that France at that time had a system of peasant proprietorship where people would go and buy very small plots of land that they would work very inefficiently and crudely, just sort of like with hand tools, and it would be, themselves and their family members working it. They could barely produce enough to feed themselves. They would have to, give away a lot in taxes and administrative costs and whatever. And even though this was like kind of a miserable existence, there would still be this fondness for like, I'm working my land. And, the intensity of the work itself didn't leave them a lot of time for tapping into social movements that were going on. And overall, this created kind of a reactionary mindset, which Marx was giving his opinion he felt was kind of a long way off from, being close to nationalizing the land, because you'd have all these little peasants who would be opposed to nationalizing the land. Anyway, continuing. To nationalize the land, in order to let it out in small plots to individuals or working men's societies, that's unions and cooperatives, would, under a middle-class government, only engender a reckless competition among themselves and thus result in a progressive increase of rent, which, in its turn, would afford new facilities to the appropriators of feeding upon the producers. At the International Congress of Brussels in 1868, one of our friends, César de Pape, in his report on land property, said, quote, "Small private property in land is doomed by the verdict of science, large land property by that of justice. There remains then but one alternative. The soil must become the property of rural associations or the property of the whole nation. The future will decide that question." Unquote. I say, on the contrary, the social movement will lead to this decision that the land can but be owned by the nation itself. To give up the soil to the hands of associated rural laborers would be to surrender society to one exclusive class of producers. The nationalization of land will work a complete change in the relations between labor and capital, and finally do away with the capitalist form of production, whether industrial or rural. Then, class distinctions and privileges will disappear together with the economical basis upon which they rest. To live on other people's labor will become a thing of the past. There will be no longer any government or state power distinct from society itself. Agriculture, mining, manufacture, in one word, all branches of production, will gradually be organized in the most adequate manner. National centralization of the means of production will become the national basis of a society composed of associations of free and equal producers, carrying on the social business on a common and rational plan. Such is the humanitarian goal to which the great economic movement of the 19th century is tending. And that's the end of the audiobook. So like I said, kind of a quick one. However, a very important topic, and good to have these perspectives from Marx sort of on record as we proceed into later eras of socialist struggles and looking at how different socialist societies solved the land question. For example, in Soviet Russia in 1917, right after the revolution, all the land was nationalized. Landlords were not compensated for the loss of their land. However, they were entitled to public support for a period of time that was considered reasonable for them to adjust to having to work for a living. And we'll be doing that audiobook of the Decree on the Land from 1917 up next on the channel. In the meantime, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. I always welcome sincere and hopefully politely worded questions in the discussion section. It's always interesting to read those, and sometimes it gives rise to entirely new ideas for videos. So thanks very much. I look forward to reading them. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons as well, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so thank you all very much for those. I appreciate them a lot, and they enable me to produce more content than I would be able to do without them. Otherwise, liking, sharing, subscribing, and leaving a comment, even if it's just good video or thanks, all of that helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm. Back in the real world, join an organization, and we'll catch you in the next video.